All right, let's dive into one of the most dramatic stories from the late 19th century. It's a story of debt, total desperation, and a political rebellion that went up against the biggest, most powerful forces in America. This is the story of the Populists.
So I want you to imagine something for a second. You are the backbone of the entire country. I mean, you literally feed the nation, you embody the American dream of independence, and yet, you're going broke. This wasn't some hypothetical. During the Gilded Age, this was the cold, hard reality for millions of American farmers. They were caught in this economic vice, and it was just getting tighter and tighter every single year.
So, you gotta ask, how on earth did things get this bad, right? To really get why the farmers revolted, we have to dig into the crisis that lit the fuse.
Okay, so it was basically a perfect storm of economic disaster. Think about it from their perspective. First, the prices they were getting for their crops, we're talking wheat, cotton, you name it, they were just plummeting, mostly due to overproduction. Second, the banks, they were hitting them with these insanely high interest rates on loans they absolutely needed for stuff like seed and equipment. And then the knockout blow, the railroads. They had a total monopoly, so they could charge these ridiculous sky-high rates just to get the crops to market. So let's just recap. They're earning less, but paying more for literally everything. It's an impossible situation.
And you know what? This chart right here, it tells the whole story. And it is brutal. Just look at that blue line. That's what farmers were earning for their products. See how it's just nosediving? Okay, now look at the black line. That's what they had to pay for everything else. And right around 1880, you can see it. The lines just start to pull apart. That big red gap growing between them? Folks, that is the debt trap. That is the entire crisis in one simple, absolutely devastating picture. So what happens when the farmers turn to the government for help? You'd think they'd get some, right? Nope, nothing. In fact, government policy was actually making everything worse. See, they reduced the amount of paper money in circulation and insisted on tying the dollar's value only to gold. This caused something called deflation. Now, you hear falling prices and you might think, hey, that sounds pretty good, but trust me, if you're in debt, it's an absolute nightmare. All of a sudden, the money you have to pay back on your loans is worth way more than the money you borrowed in the first place. Ouch.
So what do? You're crushed by debt, you're totally ignored by the politicians. Well, the farmers finally realized that if nobody was going to come and help them, they were going to have to help themselves. It was time to organize.
And right out of this crisis, a new movement is born. We call it populism. And at its core, it was a political movement, mainly of farmers, who had this one powerful idea, that the government should be there to protect ordinary people from the crazy power of big banks and huge monopolies, like the railroads.
So in 1890, they did it. They formed their own political party, the Populist Party. And let me tell you, their platform, for that time, it was wildly radical. They wanted the government to regulate the railroads. They wanted a national income tax so the wealthy would finally pay their fair share. They wanted senators to be elected directly by the people, not chosen by state legislatures, to make them more accountable. And then, and this is the big one, you guys, they wanted bimetallism. It means using both gold and silver to back the currency, which would pump more money into the system, cause a little inflation, and make those crushing debts just a little bit easier to pay off.
And honestly, this whole fight over money, gold versus silver, it became the central defining battle of the entire populist movement. I know it sounds kind of abstract, monetary policy, but it was anything but. This was a flat-out war for the economic soul of America.
Okay, let's break this down real quick. Inflation just means prices are rising. If you're selling stuff like crops, that's great for you. Deflation, on the other hand, means prices are falling. And again, that sounds pretty good on the surface, right? But the problem is it also means profits are shrinking, which means companies start laying people off, and pretty soon you have no money to buy those cheaper goods anyway. For the farmers, deflation was public enemy number one. And this right here, this shows you the trap they were in perfectly. It's called a deflationary spiral, and it is nasty. Here's how it works. Lower prices for your crops means you make less profit. Okay, that leads to you having to lay off workers and produce less. That, in turn, leads to less spending across the whole economy, more unemployment, which then creates a surplus of goods that nobody can afford to buy, which pushes prices, you guessed it, even lower. It's just this vicious downward cycle, and it was literally strangling the American farmer. So the battle lines were drawn. You had two clear sides. In one corner, you had the gold bugs. These were your bankers, your big businessmen, mostly from the Northeast. They loved the gold standard. Why? Because it kept the money supply tight and guaranteed that the loans they gave out would be repaid with stable, super valuable dollars. And in the other corner, you had the silverites. These were the farmers, the laborers from the South and the West. They wanted to add silver to create more money, cause some inflation, and finally get higher prices for their goods.
So you've got this epic conflict brewing, right? Farmers versus banks, silverites versus gold bugs, and it was all about to come to a head in what would become one of the most dramatic, high-stakes presidential elections in all of American history.
And I want to be super clear here. The Populists were not some tiny fringe group. By this point, they were a real political force to be reckoned with. Just look at the 1892 presidential election. Their guy, James Weaver, he actually won 4 states and got 22 electoral votes. They had governors, they controlled state legislatures. This was a legitimate threat to the entire two-party system.
And then, the man who would become their champion steps onto the stage, William Jennings Bryan. Now, he was a Democrat, but he totally embraced the populist cause. And at the 1896 Democratic Convention, wow, he gives one of the most famous speeches in American history, just thundering against the gold standard, and he drops this legendary line. He turned the fight for silver into a full-blown moral crusade. But in the end, it just wasn't enough. The Republican candidate, William McKinley, he was backed by all the powerful bankers and industrialists. He ran this huge, well-funded campaign all about protecting the gold standard. And McKinley won. He won the election, and with that victory, the Populist Party as a major national force was basically dead.
So that's it, right? They lost. The rebellion was crushed. End of story. But is it? What if I told you that in a strange way, by losing the battle, they actually ended up winning the war?
And this is the really wild part. The Populist Party itself, it just kind of faded away. But its ideas, oh, they stuck around. A national income tax? Yeah, that became the 16th Amendment. Direct election of U.S. senators? Hello, 17th Amendment. Government regulation of railroads, low-interest loans for farmers. All of these crazy, radical ideas eventually became the law of the land in the decades that followed. The platform that everybody thought was so extreme, it became mainstream.
So that leaves us with this really fascinating question to chew on, doesn't it? The Populists lost the big election, their party completely fell apart, and yet almost their entire core platform was eventually adopted and woven into the very fabric of America. So what does that tell us about how real change happens in this country? It seems like sometimes you can absolutely lose the battle, but still end up winning the war.